The press briefing for the 118th Monetary Policy Committee meetings took place on Monday, May 27th, after the Monetary Policy Committee had deliberated and assessed global and domestic macroeconomic developments for the first 4 months of the year and the balance of risk to the outlook. The committee decided to maintain monetary policy rate at 29%.
Central banks have remained cautious in lowering policy rates due to the sluggishness of the disinflation process. Policy rates have been kept elevated to anchor inflation expectations and further drive down long-term inflation rates.
The committee observed that the latest inflation forecast showed a slightly elevated inflation profile on account of recent exchange rate pressures and adjustments in transportation fares.
However, the projections show that inflation will remain within the monetary policy consultation clause of 13 to 17% at the end of the year. These forecasts are contingent on sustaining the tight monetary policy stance, including aggressive liquidity management operations.
The Bank of Ghana explains the inflation dynamics.
On this chart, we see inflation descending very sharply from where it was a year ago in April, 41.2%. And we see a sharp disinflation from that level, 41.2%, to April 2024, 25%. Now, these observed sharp disinflation, as can be observed from the chart, is reflected in both the food and the non-food components of inflation. Now, the observed decline in inflation from 41.2% in April 2023 to 25% in April 2024 was occasioned by a relative stability in the currency, the domestic currency, and then also a tighter monetary policy stance, a base drift effect, as well as stable petroleum prices. Now, it's important to note that despite this sharp disinflation that we observed from April 2023 to April 2024, if we look at the inflation outturn for the first quarter of the year, now we will see that inflation seemed to be sticky around the 23 figure from January, February, and then somewhere in March, we saw a little bump up in inflation. And now this sluggishness in terms of the disinflation process that we have seen is actually informed by a couple of factors. And the factors responsible for this sluggishness in the disinflation process is actually linked to reduced supply of some seasonal foods items, as well as the effect of a pass-through of exchange rate depreciation, especially on non-food inflation. Now, it's important to appreciate the fact that one of the prerequisites for implementing an inflation targeting strategy is the capacity of the central bank to be able to model and to forecast inflation. Now, to this end, the Bank of Ghana relies on a suite of near-term forecasting models to forecast inflation. Now, on the chart here is a cocktail of these forecasting models. So, these forecasting models are projecting inflation 3 months ahead, a near-term forecast of inflation. And as we look at the chart here, we can see for the month of May, 1 month ahead inflation forecast. All these suite of forecasting models seem to be suggesting a certain inflation number for the month of May. Now, let's take, for instance, the seasonal auto-regressive Integrated Moving Average Model, the SARIMA. Now, the SARIMA is suggesting that inflation for May will be around 26.8%. Now, the median forecast model is suggesting an inflation of 24.1%. If we come to the simple average forecast model, it is also projecting an inflation of 23.8%. The event steady model without judgment is suggesting an inflation of 23.3%. Now, the weighted average forecast model is also suggesting an inflation of 22.7%. Now, the mean square prediction error model, which happens to be the bank's best model, is projecting an inflation of 22.2%. And so is the e-inflation forecasting model, same 22.2%. Now, the event steady forecasting model without judgment is suggesting inflation in May will be around 21.8%. And the inflation profile for the previous time round, neutral, is also suggesting an inflation of 21.3%. And the previous inflation profile, non-neutral, is suggesting an inflation of 21.3%. Now, if you look at all the predictions from the various forecasting models, you will see a high of 26.8% and a low of 21.3%. Invariably, what it means is that May inflation from these models is forecast to be anywhere in between this high forecast and this low forecast. Now, for the bank, the best performing model, MSPE, is suggesting an inflation of 22.2%. Now, these models are updated on a periodic basis based on new information that comes. And so the models are fed with new information and a forecast is produced out of it. Now, the forecast that is generated from this suite of models provide a guide and a help for the Monetary Policy Committee to position the policy rates. Now, on this slide is a fan chart that is projecting inflation up to the end year and into the medium term with a band of probabilities wrapped around the forecast. Now, if you look at the fan chart, the red line being the bank's projection of inflation, both end year and then into the medium term. Now, if you observe the actual inflation, which is the black line, you will see a very close correlation between the bank's projection and actual inflation, as we know, had turned out in the course of time. Now, the tight monetary policy we mentioned earlier on, together with increased sterilization effort by the Bank of Ghana, is what has reinforced this declining path of inflation as we see, both for the bank's projection and even actual inflation as it turned out. Now, the end year inflation projection is looking at an inflation number between anywhere 13% and 17%. Now, if we look at the fan chart and if we trace Q4 of 2024, Q4 of 2024, here. If we go up, we will hit this red line somewhere in between the projection for the year, 13% and 15%. So it's picking up the range and it's telling us that we are likely to see inflation fall between 13% and 17% by the end of the year. Now, in the same way, the fan chart is also telling us that our inflation target into the medium term, the Q4 of 2025, is lying somewhere between 5% and 10%. And if you recall, that's the bank's medium-term inflation target of 8 plus or minus 2%. So what we are picking from the fan chart in a nutshell is that the projection to see inflation fall between 15 plus or minus 2% for end year 2024 is on course, as well as the medium-term projection where inflation is expected to return to the bank's medium-term band by 2025 Q4. Now, despite this expected realization of the end year inflation projection, as well as the medium-term forecast, we see there are risks associated to this expected forecast. And we can talk about risk associated with transportation fares, crude oil price increases, utility tariff adjustments, and some adverse movements in the domestic currency. And these factors will need close scrutiny by the central bank. Now, looking ahead, a tight monetary policy condition, an improved international reserves buffers, and efficient liquidity management strategies are expected to support this disinflation process. Inflation is expected to return to a medium-term target of 8 plus or minus 2 by the end of 2025.